Picture first a boy, not yet out of high school, standing on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. He's in West Africa, at the final place that thousands of kidnapped people would have seen of that continent, their home. The place he is standing in is a fortress, a prison, one used to hold those captives prior to their being crammed aboard sailing vessels that would have taken them half a world away. The boy stands for a long time, contemplating that vast expanse of ocean and how the journey of those ships would have led first to one of several islands in the Caribbean, thereafter to fan out all over the Americas. He absorbs the dank condition of the holding cells, and he stares at the tiny door through which those captives would have been shoved as they exited that fort and moved toward the ships. He doesn't speak. He can't speak. Nor does anyone speak that he is with. There are no words. Still, the images, the feelings, the visceral shock of that scene stay with him, kernels and seeds that continue to grow. When the boy returns to the United States, he struggles to convey what he has seen, what he has felt, even to himself. Most of his teachers, to say nothing of his friends, express little real interest or understanding in what he has witnessed. None of them really are equipped to process the enormity of that gruesome fortress on the edge of the Atlantic and what it means. In time, the boy comes to understand that his experience upon his return, when he encounters a lack of comprehension, is endemic to the United States, and perhaps throughout most of the Americas too. A proper language, together with memorials that teach the truth of what occurred here, simply don't exist. They're not here. Whereas on one side of the Atlantic, a slave fort told a story of what had occurred, of what took place there. On the opposite side of the Atlantic, it was as though nothing much had happened at all. The spaces in which those captives, the enslaved, would have arrived here in the United States, where they would have lived, where they would have worked, are not memorialized. Those spaces have become vacation resorts and Tony shopping districts. The memory erased. It was as though a kind of amnesia was at work, where language, where stories, to say nothing of humanity itself, was simply evaporated. And so the boy's inability to absorb the enormity of what he had been shown, together with the absence of public language and public memory surrounding what that scene meant on this side of the Atlantic, exposed a wider cultural truth occurring within the United States: the will not to know. The boy, of course, was me. And the site at which I stood was a slaving fort in what is now Ghana, somewhere in the vicinity of the spot that Brotir Pharaoh, the African prince that we learned about last week, who would later become Venture Smith here in Connecticut. It was somewhere in the vicinity of where he was kidnapped as a child. I was afforded the chance to visit Ghana as a high school senior, and it remains the most important journey I've ever taken. It was there that I witnessed the sheer vitality and exuberance and creativity and open-hearted kindness, miraculous kindness, I should add, of the Ghanaian people. And it was there that I fell in love. But it was also there that I stood at that slaving fort and absorbed, really for the first time, the wounds and the horrors of American history, but really of this circum-Atlantic history. Horrors that many people who looked like me perpetrated. Horrors that many Black and indigenous peoples were forced to endure. I've carried those things with me ever since. That opening on one hand toward transcendent beauty that I witnessed among the Ghanaian people, coupled with a powerful awareness of the terrors perpetrated by those who looked and spoke and worshiped, much like me. But I also absorbed the silence, the failure of language, and the erosion of memory upon my return. That too has stayed with me. I share that story to underscore something of why we've chosen to undertake this series of sermons, telling stories from the deep north, not the deep south, but the deep north. Throughout the United States, we're not familiar or familiar enough with the stories of enslavement, but in New England especially, those stories simply haven't been spoken or heard, at least not often enough. I have no illusions that we can single-handedly change that. But the sites that we're visiting on our virtual Wheels of Justice journey are a way of speaking into that silence that I first encountered on my own return from Ghana all those years ago. These stories are a way of addressing, in whatever halting or broken language I have, they're a way of addressing the failure of public memory surrounding the history of enslavement in New England and especially in Connecticut. They're a way of reclaiming forgotten lives and histories that matter in the present as we face into just how very entrenched white supremacy is in this country. I know these stories aren't easy. I know it probably makes you uncomfortable to hear them, but nevertheless, thank you for listening to them. They are necessary if we are to have an awareness of the spaces that we inhabit, of what actually occurred here, and of who was affected by those occurrences. They are necessary if we are to live humanly into the future. Today we'll be sharing 3 stories. The first, from New London, has to do with slaving voyages carried forth from that harbor. That segment will be narrated by Odile Brennan, who, I should add, also created the final video product that you're watching right now. The second is a story that I'll narrate about a house that will be familiar to many of you here in Old Lyme. It happens to be the house that I reside in with my family. The third will be narrated by Kevin Booker, an educator and a good friend who has spent time thinking about Connecticut's long history of slavery and what it means for the present. These are stories of passages. These are stories of water. These are stories of exile and pain, of being separated by the waters. These are stories of ignominy and also greed. But they're also stories of courageous survival. Come with me now. Let's head out to New London, where we'll join Odile.
New England was a key player in the slave trade, with Rhode Island the center of it all. In the 18th century, there were more than 1,000 voyages from Rhode Island to countries in Africa. More than 100,000 captives were forced back across the Atlantic Ocean on Rhode Island ships back to places like Newport. In Connecticut, ships from New London competed with those from Rhode Island. I'm here at New London Harbor when many enslaved Africans found themselves. Although many of the records were destroyed when Benedict Arnold set fire to the city in 1781, we know that New London ships worked the coast of Africa during the entire latter half of the 18th century, and likely long before that. A newly discovered ship's log supports this as common practice, detailing 3 separate voyages from New London to Africa. One of these voyages departed this harbor on January 18, 1757. It was captained by John Easton, a prosperous slaving captain from Middletown, who spent most of his life on slaving voyages. The keeper of the log was Dudley Saltonstall. His father was the mayor of New London and owned the ship, while his grandfather was the early Connecticut governor, Gurdon Saltonstall. The voyage was bound for a place called Bunce Island, located at the mouth of the Sierra Leone River, which empties into Freetown Harbor, the 3rd largest harbor in the world. Easton and Saltonstall carried rum with them, which they used for trade and opening trade negotiations along the way. By March, they were making stops at slaving outposts to trade rum for human beings. They could buy a human life with 150 gallons of rum. By April, they were at Bunce Island, making purchases. The island had become a highly desirable place to buy captive Africans in the 1750s. Georgia and South Carolina were beginning to grow rice, and Africans from Sierra Leone possessed that skill. As a result, a forced technology transfer took place, transferring agricultural knowledge from the coast of Africa to the American colonies. Easton and Saltonstall lingered at other slaving ports after Bunce Island. But by December, they were in the Caribbean in St. Kitts to offload 100 captives. Some were brought back to New London or Middletown to be sold at slave auctions. During the period that Easton and Saltonstall carried on their voyages, 400,000 to 500,000 captive Africans were taken from the Sierra Leone region. In the years they were active, more Africans were sold into slavery than during any other period of the transatlantic slave trade. In fact, between 1751 and 1775, it's estimated that 63,000 people were sold out of Africa every single year. Today, Bunce Island is abandoned and said to be haunted. After 2 centuries, the only thing left are the ruins of the last slaving castle built there.
We're here at 5 Lime Street, just across the street from the church. This is the parsonage, which was left to the church in a bequest in 1882. Since that time, beginning in 1883, each of the senior ministers of FCCOL have resided here, at least for a time. A number of others in our community have also lived here. It's been a welcoming place during that time. That's been true for my family, and I gather it's been true for previous occupants as well. but it has a relationship to slavery that we need to wrestle with. It's a history I'd like to invite all of you to consider with me. You'll notice on the front porch the plaque stating that Samuel Mather built the house in 1790. The name is right, but the date is off. It was built by Mather in 1784, about 100 years before it came into the church's possession, just after the end of the Revolutionary War. Mather was a member of this church, and he was one of the wealthiest residents of Old Lyme. People referred to him as the Merchant Prince. Mather ran a shipping business here in town, which was the source of his wealth. He owned at least 13 shipping vessels, as well as 4 warehouses in town. 2 of them were located at the mouth of the Lieutenant River, close to where the small bridge on 156 now stands. Another was on the Connecticut River, and another still was on the site of this house. Rum was stored in those river warehouses, as well as other various dry goods and luxury goods too. Where were those 13 ships sailing to when they left the Lieutenant or the Connecticut rivers? And where were those ships coming from when they returned? While we don't have precise shipping records, we can say with some certainty that one of the places those ships were going to and from was the West Indies, Barbados, Jamaica, and perhaps some other islands as well. New England began trading with the West Indies as early as 1648, when John Winthrop noted in his journal that it pleased the Lord to open us a trade to Barbados and other islands in the West Indies. As we'll learn in the next segment as well, New England became the breadbasket of the sugar plantations throughout the islands, an economy that was wholly dependent upon slave labor. It was that slave labor that made a lot of people in colonial New England extremely wealthy, and Samuel Mather was a part of that. It's likely that he would have shipped barrel staves, among other things, down to the Caribbean, where those staves would have been used to build barrels for storing and thereafter shipping molasses, which was then used to make rum. So a large portion of Mather's fortune would have been dependent on the slave trade. Samuel Mather himself owned at least 4 enslaved people. They would have lived here. There was an L at the rear of the house that's no longer standing, and that's probably where they would have resided. Each of the 4 would have worked as stevedores on the docks, or they would have done agricultural or domestic labor here on this site. It's likely that they would have hauled the timber and the stones used for building this beautiful home. And it's likely that their hands would have helped to frame the walls or to pound the nails that continue to hold things like the floorboards in place. It's not too much to surmise that the parsonage was built, at least in part, by enslaved black labor. 3 of the 4 individuals enslaved by Samuel Mather are unknown to us by name, but we know one name. Her name was Janny, and in 1795, Janny had a child who she named Jack Howard. Jack grew up on these grounds, in this house, and at the age of 14, he was willed to Samuel Mather's son, James, who also resided here. Here's where it's helpful to use your imagination. We don't know who Jack's father was, though it might well have been one of the other individuals enslaved here. But we know that Jack wouldn't have been alone. In addition to the 3 others, along with Janny, there were several people living next door in the McCurdy house, according to the 1790 census, and there were also a number of others living across the street in a property where the church now stands. That number included several children. That's a significant cluster of enslaved African Americans on this one single corner alone during that period of time. We can't help but wonder what Jack's life might have been like here at this house that has become the parsonage. I confess I wonder about him as I watch my own son play and grow here, and I can't help but feel a profound sense of sorrow as I consider the indignities and the inhumanity and the confusion that Jack must have experienced in this very place as a child and then as an adolescent. and then later as a young man. As for the other enslaved people who lived here at 5 Lime Street, and those who lived next door and across the street, we can wonder just how they arrived here. Perhaps, like Jack, they were born here. Perhaps they were purchased in another part of New England and then arrived here that way. Recall that the DeWolf family were smuggling captive Africans into Rhode Island as late as the 1820s. Might any of those living here have been subjected to the Middle Passage themselves? If not, was it their parents or their grandparents who did so? How close was the memory of that traumatic event? And where did those ancestors arrive from? Might they have originally been from Sierra Leone, like those that Odile described earlier? Might they have been from what is now Ghana, what then was known as Guinea, like Venture Smith? Might they have come from further south in Africa, in the Congo, Angola region, like one of the men we'll shortly meet up in Wethersfield? I wish we knew the answer to those questions. But we can wonder what all those who were enslaved here on Lime Street saw when they looked upon this house. And we can wonder what they thought as they gazed upon the waters of the Lieutenant River and the Connecticut River. Would they have ached for the world beyond those waters? For a home they would never have seen and could only imagine? Would they have ached for a home that was not here, but somewhere back across the waters? Or perhaps might they have understood this place, this house, to be their home? Could those all be true at once? I want to ask, what did they see when they looked upon the Samuel Mather house? It's impossible to say with certainty. What it is possible to say is that Jack, an enslaved child, lived here. What it is possible to say is that Jack grew up here in this house. It's possible to say that his mother, Jannie, together with 3 others, lived here, right here, along with a handful of other enslaved Americans of African descent. They lived right here on Lime Street, and I believe we have an obligation to remember them. Though the hour is late, it's still not too late to render them honor. But there's a similar story that's worth sharing from yet another Connecticut town. Let's head up the Connecticut River a ways, where we'll pick up the story in Wethersfield.
Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Booker Jr. and you're watching Wheels of Justice, Stories of the Deep North. And one of the stories we need to tell has to do with the formation of New England's economy in the 17th and 18th centuries. Because the key factor in the rise of New England economy was slavery, only a few New England merchants actually engaged in the slave trade, but they all profited from it. They all lived off of it. Indeed, all in New England did. Here's how it worked. And I'm going to say it again. Here's how it worked. Northern colonies sent food, livestock, and wood to be used for making barrels to the sugar plantations in the Caribbean islands, especially, though not limited to, Barbados and Jamaica. There, enslaved Africans harvest sugar, cane that fed the refining mills on the islands. Sugar and molasses was shipped back to the north, right where I'm standing right now. Not the south, but shipped back to the north, usually in barrels made from New England wood. Sometimes those ships were accompanied by enslaved Africans. Northern distilleries turned the molasses into rum, which would then be traded for captives in Africa who were then shipped to the sugar plantations. Shipped to the sugar plantations to provide a sense of scale between 1640 and 1650, and that 10-year period. English ships delivered 19,000 captives, enslaved Africans to work in Barbados. And by 1700, the total was 134,000. Barbados, just to give you a clear indication of the size of Barbados, is about the size of the borough of Queens in New York City. In other words, quite small, but think about the total of enslaved Africans, which was in 1700, 134,000. And by 1700, Jamaica had absorbed 85,000 enslaved Africans as well. And the scale is immense to consider. Now, here's what's important to know about New England's relationship to those islands that I just mentioned. A quick recap. The two islands that I just mentioned was Barbados and Jamaica. Now, 1600s, 1700s. Let's take a look at how this is all interconnected. The agriculture of the islands was entirely devoted to sugar production, since it was so profitable. They didn't grow their own food in the West Indies. It was far more profitable to import it from, you guessed it, New England. On the eve of the American Revolution, almost 80% of New England's overseas exports went to the British West Indies to the Caribbean. From New England river towns and then on to major cities, the Northeast sent flour, dried fish, corn, potatoes, onions, where many of the onions were stored right here in this warehouse, and also livestock, cattle, and horses. That allowed Barbados and Jamaica to maximize their production of sugar. And that's why we're standing here today in Wethersfield, Connecticut. The town became famous for one crop in particular: onions. Onions maidens. The women who lived in Wethersfield and cultivated the crop grew them in their backyards. And as late as 1800, they produced 100,000 5-pounds of ropes of onions, most all of it destined for the West Indies. The islands were so dependent on New England agriculture production that during the Revolution, when colonial ships would come up this river here that you're looking at behind me, couldn't get through a blockade, famine, swept through the sugar islands. And between 1780 and 1787, some 15,000 enslaved people in Jamaica starved. I'm going to say that again for all of you who are listening to watching this awesome, incredible show right now. Between 1780 and 1787, some 15,000 enslaved people in Jamaica starved. That number is startling in its own right, but it also reveals how deeply enmeshed places like Wethersfield, but really every colonial town, was in the maintenance of African slavery. Wethersfield, Old Lyme, and so many other charming, wonderful New England towns. When we drive through these towns and we say to ourselves, did slavery exist in these towns? Yes, they did, because of the sugar plantations and because of slavery throughout the Caribbean. Now, there is one other thing that I want to show you all, but I need you to come along with me. So let's go. Now, last thing about Wethersfield and the town cemetery where I am standing right now, we find very interesting headstones for a man named Quash Gomer right here behind me. And near his headstone lie two others. One for Tenor Abel right here, and who died in 1795. And one for Francois. He only goes by the first name Francois, who was born in the continent of Africa. They don't actually say the country and what country. And died in Wethersfield, right here in Wethersfield, at the age of 55. Now, we don't know much about the other two individuals that I just spoke about, Tenor Abel and Francois. Wow, just imagine some of the things that they had to encounter and things that they had to overcome. But we know a little bit about Quash Gomer right behind me. His stone tells us that he originally came from Angola and he was kidnapped and brought here when he was 16 or 17 years old. So I want you to all think about it. Imagine being kidnapped at the age of 16 or 17 years old, taken away from your family members, taken away from your customs and your culture, and you come to this strange land, this land where the language is different, people around you look different, the customs, their values, their morals, everything is different. And he still has his own beliefs and values. And Angola means that he likely would have come from an area that practiced Congo, forms of rituals and medicine, an area that provided the basic substrata of cultural life in Haiti, in Cuba, and in New Orleans, and in Charleston, and elsewhere. Wow, we don't know exactly what happened to this amazing man named Quash Gomer. May have brought him with him in terms of cultural memory. He was old enough, remember, he was 16 or 17 years old when he arrived right here in Wethersfield, Connecticut. But he was old enough to remember what he had learned when he was in Angola. His presence in Wethersfield is a hint that perhaps some aspects of Congo religion and practice existed right here in Connecticut, right here in Wethersfield, Connecticut. We can wonder whether Quash Gomer and others like him preserve their culture in secret, practicing their own African customs right here in Wethersfield, Connecticut. We don't know, but we can wonder. And here is one other thing about Quash Gomer. He died a free man. I want you to look at right now at the headstone, right in front of me right now, on this side right here. And he died a free man. And through his own industry, he purchased his freedom for 25 pounds, and he became a prosperous man. He had 10 children. And through accounting records, we know some of the goods he purchased at local stores. Among those goods were strings for a fiddle. Music was part of his life. So you wonder, what influence did some of these extraordinary individuals have on the culture and the life right here in Wethersfield, Connecticut? And let's think beyond that as well in the state of Connecticut. Because you're watching Wheels of Justice in the Deep North. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Well, we're back here in the meeting house, having visited New London and a space here in Old Lyme and Wethersfield, all of them located along waterways, which once served as portals or passageways to lost worlds. They are deep rivers that many may have wished to cross again. When I think about the lives we encountered in our stories today, I imagine those individuals staring at the waters, meditating upon the lost world on the opposite side of that crossing. That world was known firsthand by Quash Gomer from Wethersfield. The others would have known it only at second or third or fourth hand, through the memories of others, handed down and passed along like treasures, like precious bits of spiritual nourishment. I also imagine what it must have been like to be cut off from the symbols and the ritual life that would have sustained all of those individuals. Each of those who made it as far as Connecticut would have carried pieces of that lost sacred world somewhere within them, a world of ancestors and spirits, of ceremonies and of dances, and especially of drummed rhythms. Those sacred worlds were soon reblended up and down the Americas to dazzling spiritual effect. I can't help but wonder how those practices would have manifested all throughout New England. It would have been different than what occurred in Charleston. It would have been different from what occurred in New Orleans. It would have been different from what occurred throughout the Caribbean. But I believe that cultural life would have manifested itself in some way here too, even in Connecticut, even in Wethersfield, even in Old Lyme. We'll close this segment with a song from a Haitian band called Ram, a group that I've been privileged to spend time with in Port-au-Prince. The song is called Congo Aidez-moi prier, which means Congo, help me to pray. The words are these: Congo, help me to pray. I don't have a mother. I don't have a father. Congo, help me to pray. As you listen to it, I want you to know that Congo here signifies not a country per se, but a spiritual home. The way the psalmist would have spoken of Jerusalem, like in Psalm 137. And I also want you to hear that the inability that the singer experiences to pray corresponds to the image in the Psalms where the singer hangs up his or her harp upon a willow tree. Prayer, song becomes inaccessible. I imagine this is a song that might have been sung by Quash Gomer, exiled from Angola, where Congo rites and rituals would have been practiced. But I imagine the song might also apply to others from different geographies and different spiritual traditions who had to learn how to pray all over again, who had to learn what it meant to take up their harps from the willow tree once again. Importantly, however, I'd like to suggest that perhaps, just perhaps, the song might even apply to those of us who are white, to those of us who practice Christianity. The January 6th events reminded us all too clearly that certain forms of Christian faith are funding white supremacy in the United States. But the stories that we're confronting here in the deep north force upon us the deeper realization that we ourselves aren't as far removed from that diabolical alliance as we might wish to believe. We too, in congregational churches in New England, have been a part of that terrible alliance. That realization may produce a kind of estrangement from our own tradition. It may be that we too begin to feel like orphans and exiles from a history, a theology, a tradition that has all too often been used to prop up white supremacy. And so maybe we too are the ones in need of help if we are to pray. Maybe we too are the ones who need to learn how to take up our harps yet again, but in a different vein. Maybe we do well to join ourselves with those who also experience themselves as more than a little lost. Maybe we too should begin to rethink what the sacred even means and who it applies to and what expressions embody it. Maybe we do it first by recovering these stories, and then by making ourselves familiar with the sacred traditions that came from across the ocean, from across that deep river, that have far too long been suppressed, but which may well have been practiced in these spaces all around us in some form. I wish to suggest that maybe we begin the necessary work of healing by appealing to Congo as we too learn and learn again what it is to pray. As we too learn and learn again what it is to take up our harps to sing the Lord's song.
Congo, Congo, Congo et d'embryer. Congo, Congo, Congo et d'embryer. Page maman, page papa, Congo et d'embryer. Congo, Congo, Congo et d'embryer. Congo, Congo, Congo et d'embryer. Page maman, page papa, Congo et d'embryer. Congo, Congo. Congo dem prier. Congo, Congo, Congo dem prier. Bague maman, bague papa. Congo dem prier. Bague maman, bague papa. Congo dem prier. Bague maman.